We are very lucky to have today in front of you right now 3 former chairmen of the most applicable and important federal regulators to our industry, and the top lawyer at the only federally chartered crypto bank. And I'm here too. I'm Marco Santori. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Kraken, but I want to give each of these esteemed scholars an opportunity to introduce themselves.
Okay. Jay Clayton, former chair of the SEC, now advising various companies on where crypto regulation is and may go.
Chris Giancarlo, former chairman of the CFTC, predecessor to Heath Tarbert at the CFTC.
And Heath Tarbert, former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for International Markets, CFTC chair, and now Chief Legal Officer and Head of Corporate Affairs for Circle.
I'm TuongVy Lee, the General Counsel of Anchorage Digital, which, as Marco mentioned, is home to the only federally chartered crypto bank.
All right. So I want to talk about 2 things today, just 2. And I want to go into quite a bit of depth about both of them. We're lucky to have these people in front of us today, but we are also lucky in one other respect, in that they do not agree. Cool. First thing I want to talk about is stablecoins. There have been a number of attempts at legislation on stablecoins over the years. I think, Heath, I think you'll share in my opinion that this time it's different. Why don't you give us a quick rundown of the status of stablecoin legislation today in the U.S.?
Sure. So I would say we're closer than we ever have before. And I think the fact that other countries like the European and other areas like the European Union, Singapore, Japan, everyone has sort of passed legislation on stablecoins. The United States remains behind, but there is some hope. Last summer, we have a House bill that actually passed out of committee with bipartisan support. That is being worked on. That's the Chairman McHenry bill, and he had worked on it a little bit with Congresswoman with Waters. They were unable to reach an agreement, but behind the scenes, they've been working for a year. So we're hopeful that they may get a broad bipartisan consensus there. We also, at the same time, have Senator Lummis's bill with Senator Gillibrand that covers a number of things, but stablecoins is one of them. And there's also other movement to get stablecoins on the agenda in the Senate as well. So we do have pieces of legislation in both houses that would comprehensively regulate stablecoins.
How would they do it? What are the headlines of the regulation? Sketch out what would the regulatory framework for stablecoins be like under.
Yeah, so under the House bill, for example, it is first of all, they make a distinction between payment stablecoins and other kinds of digital assets. And so the idea is, if you have something that is really used as a payment tool, essentially the equivalent of the dollar, that would be subject to its own regime. And it sets up sort of a federal floor, but it allows for both state and federal chartered stablecoin issuers. And it requires, for example, that every dollar is backed by safe dollar-based assets like T-bills, similar to what, quite frankly, Circle and Paxos and other firms do today. It has transparency standards, and it also has a supervisory framework, and it would apply, the AML rules. But the important part of it is we get the benefit of a single federal stablecoin regime. We don't have to necessarily, it preempts the 50 states and having to deal with conflicting laws. It also is incredibly helpful in the overseas world, because without a federal stablecoin law here in the United States, it's very difficult to get reciprocity overseas. And I would much rather have the United States regulating dollars than some foreign country.
Do we really need that, though? Do we really need a single federal regulator for stablecoins?
Well, under the legislation, there would both be that the Fed would have a potential role, but the states would as well. So while there would be a federal regulator, you could have a state charter. And so there would be a set of basic standards that all stablecoins had to follow that Congress set, but filling in the rest of the gaps would basically be up to the states or the Fed.
Marco, let me lay out for you one of the risks of not having legislation. Stablecoins are an important transmission mechanism for the dollar and the values of which the dollar are based. Stablecoins serve to satisfy the global demand for dollars that simply can't be met today in our analog world or in paper dollars. And yet, we are at risk of losing control of our own instrument, the dollar, by not having stablecoin legislation. I'll tell you what I mean by that. We're now seeing dollar-based stablecoins created under the jurisdiction of foreign jurisdictions, whether it be Singapore or in the case of Circle, France. It's France and the laws of France that are going to set some of the basic terms of a dollar-based stablecoin. So, for example, the Circle, the dollar-based instrument, the buffer that's kept over the amount of stabilization dollars are set by France, not by the United States. If that pattern emerges, you're going to see more and more stablecoin operators forming their dollar-based stablecoin under the laws of foreign jurisdictions, not the United States. And in time, we lose control of our own instrument.
So does that mean that, in effect, other countries would be able to exercise monetary policy over the dollar if stablecoins really take off?
If extrapolated out, yeah.
Yeah, so there are national security implications here as well as to who can issue the dollar, how the dollar is regulated, whether foreign dollars can be issued, and their potential impact on our country.
Money is much more than just a monetary instrument. It's also the expression of the values. It's a question of convertibility. As we move to digital networks, what are going to be the elements of anonymity, of privacy, all of the values that are going to go into. And I believe the dollar should be an expression of American values. But are we going to allow foreign countries to set that value set on things called the dollar? And, it's interesting. Historically, the Americans stole the dollar from the Spanish, right? The dollar, basically, we copied what was the most valuable instrument during the European exploration of North America, the Spanish dollar. We copied its name. We colored the S symbol with the two lines from it. And we even copied the design. The fact that the dollar is dividable to halves, quarters, and what used to be bits, half quarters, which was 8/8, reflected the old pieces of 8 by which the Spanish dollar was divisible. We did it because the Spanish didn't protect their dollar ownership. We're now doing this. We're at risk of doing the same thing. We haven't laid claim to our own ownership of the dollar by not creating stablecoin legislation in Washington.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate. That all sounds great. We don't want other countries, as Americans, as patriots, we're here in Wyoming after all, we don't want other countries exercising monetary policy over our dollar. Why do we need a federal law for that? Right now we have state laws that effectively regulate stablecoins, don't they?
Show me any major economy in human history where government has not exercised authority over its currency. I mean, maybe it's possible. I'm not aware of it historically ever happening.
Is there a concern, though, that if we pass federal regulation of stablecoins here, and especially if they're overly onerous, that will accelerate the move away from U.S.-issued stablecoins to foreign issuers, right?
Of course, we got to get the legislation right.
Yeah, but I think some people are potentially going to opt for U.S. dollar and treasury-backed stablecoins where the U.S. government doesn't have jurisdiction.
Here's what I would say. Dollar-based stablecoins are going to be regulated. The only question is whether we're going to do the regulating or we're going to let foreign governments do the regulating.
I think we should look at this. Look, legislation, I've always been a little bit dubious about legislation because, legislation just triggers the regulatory starting gun, right? Almost all congressional legislation has an implementation period. So you're going to be right back in front of the regulators in terms of implementation. But if legislation is a forcing function to change the mindset, that's what we need. And what we've had is a failure of mindset in that innovation is coming to dollar-based transactions around the globe. Innovation is coming to what backs dollar-based transactions, which is the treasury market. And until we get a mindset across the federal banking regulators, the SEC and the CFTC, that is going to happen, we're not going to have much. So I see if legislation acts actually as a real forcing function, okay. But if we continue to have regulators who I would say are reticent to technological change and the philosophy that you just articulated, Chris, we're going to still have a problem. And until I hear that our successors are actually taking steps to understand everything you just said and how you're going to do it consistent with AML, KYC, I continue to be dubious. So I want to hear from them instead of them saying saying they're waiting for Congress is a total cop-out.
And I don't disagree with that at all. But at the end of the day, if Congress is going to act, then that if it serves that forcing mechanism, then
I agree with you. But Congress acted to try and look, we have the most rigorously regulated capital raising system in the world. The only exception for that is the private placement market. Congress has continued to act to try and free up the private placement market, provide more access to the general public to what I would say are alternative investments. And every step of the way, the banking regulators and the SEC, I tried to fight it, have, said no. So we need a mindset change as well as legislative change.
yeah, I don't disagree with that. It's very important, but ultimately it's Congress that's elected by the people of this country. Congress needs to do its job, and part of that job is telling the regulators, we write the law, you implement it.
Mm-hmm. Jay, I agree with you. I think the mindset change is vitally necessary. And part of in addition to what we need to change that mindset is wait a second, let me just make a point. We just had a supermajority of Congress say that SAB 121 needs to go, and it's still there.
It's still there because the president vetoed.
Right.
So that's the most important election, and that will also take care of the position.
But the point we need to add to that mindset change is also we need to change the mindset that U.S. regulators seem to think that they can control everything that happens in the world. And the fact of the matter is this technology is going to move where it can grow.
Chris, no, I agree. Right.
I'm hearing this, and what I'm hearing is the three of you gentlemen making V's point for her. I have to say, as far as I can tell, let me make sure I understand your point first of all. What's the largest stablecoin in the world? Shout it out, audience.
Tether.
Yeah. Don't you think one of the reasons people use Tether is because it has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, and it's not subject to the things that we're talking about today, and that it is about as free a market as can be? Isn't this the point you're making?
Do you know when the move towards Tether's increasing market share started to really happen? It was after the first Tornado Cash sanction. And then they've grown to the percentage of market share.
And is this because the community just didn't want to risk involvement with the U.S. political system?
I think it's that, but it's also they thought that the way that the law was being applied was inappropriate, or there should be better laws. If we're going to have regulation, and I agree that there should be some, that's something that we should think about, right? Because if it does just accelerate the move away from our jurisdiction over certain stablecoin issuers, that's going to hurt our national security and the primacy of the U.S. dollar even more.
I think you're right, but Tether has made huge steps to actually become what I would say is a U.S.-centric issuer by bringing everything back into short-dated treasuries and being very public about it.
Yeah.
And saying you want to see them, they're at Bank of New York.
You should welcome that.
Yeah, no, but there's a convergence, right?
I will say there is a major difference, though, that you're pointing out, which is, I think, Circle's making a very different bet on the future. Of course, in countries that are the former Soviet republics and everything, Tether is doing really well. It's doing well in many countries. But I think Circle's view is that if we get this right, crypto will become mainstream and blockchain technology will merge with the traditional financial system, and we will have an internet-based financial system. And if that's the case, it will look more like a Circle, a regulated financial institution. So we are explicitly making that bet. You guys made that bet as well. Now, it's been tough, just to be very clear, for all the reasons we've discussed, but that's a fundamental difference.
I think there's two forcing functions, too, that we can't ignore. Number one is Article 3 of our Constitution, right, which the lawyers up here like, the courts. They may make this moot, this point of, golly, should we regulate, should we legislate? They may make this point moot, but I think maybe the more impending potential mooting factor is CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, and this is a topic I know is near and dear to Chris Giancarlo's heart. Chris, you're the co-founder of the Digital Dollar Project and its executive chairman. Can you tell us a little bit about the project and part of the philosophy that drives it and how it ties into stablecoins?
So the Digital Dollar Project is not a commercial enterprise. It's a 501c3 educational institution. It's nonpartisan. It's nonprofit. It brings together about 4 dozen thought leaders from across the political spectrum, across the commercial spectrum, who recognize one thing. They recognize that the future is going to be a future where value moves on digital networks. Some of those digital networks are going to be highly centralized and run by governments like China and the EU. Others going to be run by commercial concerns like Circle and Paxos, where I have the pleasure of serving on the board. And others are going to be decentralized like Bitcoin and Ethereum. The future is going to be all of the above. And the Digital Dollar Project exists to ask the following question. In that future of digital networks of value, how do we future-proof the dollar to continue to serve its purpose in that world? How do we preserve the values on which the dollar stands? Values of free enterprise, free financial expression, of a reasonable privacy balanced with appropriate law enforcement. How do we do all that? And what is the right balance between the private sector and the public sector in making that happen? The Digital Dollar Project does not advocate for a U.S. CBDC, or at least the deployment of one. But it doesn't close its mind. It doesn't follow this wooden calculus that seems to be popular right now. If you're on the right side of the aisle, CBDC bad, stablecoins good. If you're on the left side of the aisle, CBDC good, stablecoins bad. It recognizes that the risks of invasion of privacy exist throughout all of those systems. It recognizes that the values inherent in the dollar need to be advanced, and the dollar's reserve currency role needs to be advanced. And how do we do that in that future? And that's what the Digital Dollar Project exists to do. It's complicated. It's much more complicated than the political calculus that says CBDC is a threat to our liberty, and yet somehow stablecoins are just going to not use that data and just bury it in the ground. I mean, financial data is of tremendous value, and it's going to be valuable whether it's commercial. And by the way, government can more easily censor private sector innovation in digital currency and with a CBDC. Why? Because at least a CBDC is governed by the Fourth Amendment protection of privacy, and commercial activity is not. So just as government has taken social media and censored its activity, it can do the same thing if we don't protect stablecoin operators from government interference, which we need to do in the legislation.
Yeah, and I would just say some of the fear, I think, is we look at what China's done, we look at what Russia's doing, and therein lie the example. And so there's part of me, which wants America to lead, and we don't want the Fed to be technologically far behind, but I'm always reminded that if the capability is there, the intention can change overnight, right? So it's like, well, of course the government's not going to spy on us, right? So a lot of people think that's a bridge too far. It raises fundamental concerns. Yeah. You what?
I think it's a bridge too far. And I think having privity with the government over, when I would say all dollar-based stores of value is a very scary thing.
You don't think the Fourth Amendment is sufficient to protect us there?
No.
This is because, Chris, this is the point you were making, right? At least if, in the case of a CBDC, we can default to the Fourth Amendment and the court's interpretation of illegal search and seizure. But
let me explain why.
If a government tells a stablecoin operator, hey, nice license you got there, it'd be a shame if we had to pull it because you're allowing people to buy ammunition.
Surely not. That wouldn't happen in this industry. A choke point operation? Otherwise legal but politically disfavored industries being relieved of their economic rights? Could you believe this could happen?
At least if it was a government CBDC, I'd have a claim under the Fourth Amendment. Now, we do not advocate the deployment of a CBDC, however, but we advocate a deeper level of thought. Let me give you another reason why I think we need to be open-minded to CBDC.
Hold on. I do want to explore this point. Jay, you said you didn't buy it.
No, two reasons. One is I don't think the government has the technological sophistication to actually operate a CBDC that goes out to 360 million maybe. Okay? I think that the redundancy and checks and actual, what I would say is innovation that's created by private sector actors is a much more, a much better way to run the system. Secondly, I agree with Chris that the Fourth Amendment is there and you have to be worried about it. I think that when you have multiple participants in digital cash, which is what we're talking about, who have a commercial interest to attract people, I want them seated at the table if the government tries to come and take it.
I agree 100% with that. I think the best balance is some balance and not you. Let me give you another.
Single issuers are dangerous.
Yeah. So in the current analog banking system, 90% of money is bank issued money. 10% is cash. And yet you can make the argument that 90% would not exist but for the 10%. And why is that? Because people are comfortable putting their money, quote, in the bank, because in a crisis, they can go to the ATM and do two things. One is take possession of their money. But what they're really doing is converting a bank IOU to an Uncle Sam IOU. They're going to a higher credit rating. They're going from a bank liability to a sovereign liability. Now, let's say in a digital future, we have now digital currency in the form of stablecoins. But what do you do when there's a run? How do you convert from a commercial liability into a sovereign liability? Well, if there's no digital dollar, the US CBDC, you go to a digital euro because you're desperate to get into a sovereign liability. Or you buy treasury. If you can, on the middle of a Saturday night.
Go ahead. Yeah. It's true. There is an alternative currency for this. Okay.
Sorry, we got you off track.
No, I didn't.
But all of these things need to be explored. That's why the Digital Dollar Project exists. We've got so much, and I applaud you. Yeah, well, thanks, Jay. But, we've got so much work to do. We can't allow our politicians to put us into this wooden box that says one is going to be, the future is going to be complex as the past has been, even more so. We're going to have competing networks of value. Interoperability is going to be a huge issue. How do all these systems work? And as beneficiaries of the dollar, we've got a vested interest as a society to make sure anything that's dollar-based is fully interoperable with other things that are dollar-based. And the U.S. is not. I'll give you one more point. 30 years ago, when the first wave of the Internet came about, an Internet of Information, the United States was front and center to make sure that the Internet of Information was one that was appropriate to free society. We not only set the rules, we set the institutions like the Internet Society and ICANN that set the rules for the Internet. 30 years later, we're not even present on the global stage. The Europeans and the Chinese are setting the rules for digital money. Foreign countries are setting the rules for dollar-based stable.
I don't want to blast. Let me quickly answer this.
Yeah.
This is why we need a regulatory mindset, because when you get stablecoin legislation, if the people at the Treasury aren't saying, how do we have interoperability with the short-term Treasury market, which is the grease? It's not cash. It's not the short-term Treasury market is the grease for the dollar-based standard around the globe. Unless they have a mindset that's we have to have interoperability there, we're not really moving forward.
Jay, was 3 years ago that you wrote in the Wall Street Journal that we need to move the Treasury market on chain?
Yes.
Well, you have it. Stablecoins. Okay, second issue I want to talk about today.
We haven't thought about this at all.
They give us 45 minutes and we have to talk about everything. So the second topic I wanted to cover today is market structure. This is something that is very, very hot in the press right now. There is legislation on the Hill today in the United States being developed. I'll give just a quick, short summary of where we are in the U.S. versus where we are in the rest of the world. But then a lot of these issues that apply to stablecoins apply equally to market structure regulation, but they come out in completely different ways. So to set the stage, the U.S. is once again behind in market structure regulation. A year ago, I testified in front of House Financial Services and House Agriculture Committees that we need clarity as an industry Obviously, we want a safe and sane regulatory environment. We have preferences on how we think the industry ought to be regulated, but above all, we need clarity. The clarity that would allow us to deploy capital, that will allow us to plan, to hire, to build products that people want to use. We need that here in the United States. We mostly have it in Europe. We have something called MiCA in Europe, which is a regulatory framework for digital assets, bespoke, custom-made over the last few years, that sets out basic guidelines of functional regulation for markets in crypto assets, as they call them there. We don't yet have that here. What we have, though, is progress. I think we have progress. It's easy to look at what's happening in DC over crypto regulation and think it's all churn, it's never going to go anywhere. But I don't think I'm alone in believing that we are as close as we've ever been to clarity in DC. We have FIT 21 that passed the House with an overwhelming bipartisan wave of support. 71 Democrats signed on to this bill, certainly more than I think most Republicans thought were going to sign on to it. Now on the Senate side, more work in development that would actually give, as far as we can tell, near complete supervision of spot markets and digital assets to the CFTC. Not the SEC, who seems to have claimed authority over these markets. We would argue without legislative authority to do that. But that's the path that we're on. The path that we're on is the Hill handing, if not complete control, and nearly complete control of supervision of digital asset markets to the CFTC. So, let's start with that. Should we have a single federal regulator for digital asset spot markets?
So let's just be clear. The legislation proposes that for digital commodities, the CFTC would have
This is an important
spot authority. For digital securities, the SEC would have authority. So it's not handing it all to the CFTC. Let's talk about the unique American division of financial regulation between two agencies. It's virtually unique in the developed world. Almost all other major economies have one regulator for financial markets. We have two. Now, it may seem problematic. I would argue it is classic American separation of powers. I think the two agencies keep each other on the toes, and I think that's kind of and I would say in our current environment, I'm grateful that the CFTC is not under the control of the current chairman of the SEC, because then all progress in terms of digital commodities would come to a grinding halt. And I do think that there's a certain logic, but it does make things challenging. And I think part of the problem we have today is jockeying for position between the two agencies. Congress is seeking to to put forward legislation that recognizes that divide by separating it. So it's going to remain the complexity that it has, but that's the first challenge. Right. I don't want to. I'll let others jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not to say that the CFTC couldn't be a good regulator of crypto spot markets if it was properly resourced, et cetera. The concern I would have, I spent almost 6 years at the SEC. The concern I would have is that it's not experienced in the same way that the SEC is, with retail-facing, disclosure-based regulation. And so that would be my concern with having them be the primary or sole regulator.
So that's a great concern, and that's why I think it reinforces the point that Chris made, that if it is in fact a digital security, if it's a digital asset that's a security that requires periodic disclosures, because ultimately the value of it is based on the efforts of others behind it, then it does need that. But if in fact it truly is a commodity, it's Bitcoin. You don't need anybody to say what Bitcoin is and give you updates. Bitcoin is Bitcoin. It's supply and demand in the market. Then I do think the CFTC has the expertise in that.
It's a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding that there's no disclosure in commodity markets. It's just the source of disclosure has been third-party sources. So there's plenty of disclosure on gold. It's put out every day by Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan. And there's plenty of disclosure on gold. There's plenty of disclosure. It's just that there's no issuer to issue that disclosure. Under this divide, digital commodities spot market would be regulated by the CFTC, digital securities would be regulated by the SEC, and the source of disclosure will have to be worked out, just as MiCA's worked that out in Europe with their notion of being white papers.
And so if that's the regime that we want, it needs to be really clear in the legislation what is a security and what is a commodity, because otherwise we're just stuck in the same situation, even with legislation that we're in now, right? Where market participants, what does it mean to be decentralized?
But it needs to be really clear, is a moment in time question, and something at one moment in time can perform the function of a securities transaction. It can perform a capital raising function. And at another later moment in time, it can perform the function of a commodity, a utility, a use case, or something like that. The explanation that I give to people in my class is, think of, and maybe some of you have heard this, think of a Broadway play. It's not yet running. It's just a thought. We all get together and we say to all of you, everybody give us $1,000, and you know what? We're going to give you 1,000 tickets. 4 years from now, we're going to have a great play. We go out, we hire Elton John, we talk to Disney, we get a whole bunch of puppets, we put on the Lion King. You know what? You guys were betting on us pulling that off, and what you engaged in with us was a securities transaction. 5 years later, you go to the box office, you buy a ticket, it's just a ticket. It's the exact same ticket. At one point, it's performing the function of a capital raising investment securities transaction. Later, it's not. That's the difficulty that people in digital asset space have faced. I'm very nervous about giving spot market jurisdiction over commodities to any federal agency.
Have we ever had that, Jay? Have we in the U.S. ever had a federal regulator for spot markets in commodities?
No, because are they going to go regulate Lion King tickets or Taylor Swift tickets?
eBay?
Those are digital commodities, on your phone.
But that doesn't mean there hasn't been regulation. Okay, so gold sales at the jewelry store are still regulated by state commercial fairness laws and fraud laws. It's the reason why we haven't had federal regulation is because at the time, states were zealously guarding their own domestic marketplaces. Cattle markets are regulated under state law. And so the grant of jurisdiction to the federal was to oversee those markets that couldn't be regulated entirely at the state level. But we're now going into a new technology that'd be very hard to regulate at the state level. And therefore, I think there's an argument in the unique case of digital commodities, a federal regulator does make sense.
So to Jay's point about with your Broadway ticket example, my question is, does it even make sense to pursue legislation that turns on things like how decentralized a token is when we've had two judges now, right? The judge in the Ripple case, and more recently the judge in the Binance case, say that secondary market token sales, for the most part, are not securities.
This is a great point that you make, which is not very well understood and should be. Capital raising transactions are capital raising securities transactions are incredibly heavily regulated. Secondary market securities transactions, you bought a bond 2 years ago and you want to sell it now, are incredibly lightly regulated. There's actually very little regulation around those. I think what we're really talking about is what is the regulation of the platform that digital assets that have been issued and widely distributed should look like.
Well, that's an important distinction to make, because it is the distinction that one of the efforts underway on the Hill actually makes. This is the ancillary asset approach, right? It says, look, capital raising transactions could indeed be regulated as capital raising transactions, but the products of those transactions, the tokens that come out of those transactions, actually very unlikely to pass the Howey test. And this is what two federal judges have now agreed on, and we think a third will as well. But this is a solution, right? That is being proposed in the Hill. It's a political solution, just like the Securities Act was a political solution, just like the Commodity Exchange Act was a political solution to a very complex problem.
Marco, I'd love to hear your views on this, right? So you actually are...
No, I'm the moderator. I was told.
No. I'm going to jump in as a co-moderator here because you actually run an exchange, right? And you now are registered with what? Whatever, 50 money transmitters.
50,000 regulators.
Yeah, 50,000 regulators to be able to have this primary market. What do you think? What's the practical import for a company like Crack?
Yeah. Oh, an angel just got its wings. Judge Torres got it right. There is a fundamental intellectual distinction between an investment contract and the product of that investment contract. And it's not just an academic one. It's a practical one because it speaks to the risks of each of those transactions. Just as you all were saying earlier, there is a full-throated disclosure regime that applies to capital raising transactions because there are investor-like risks that come along with those transactions. But at some point, those investor-like risks give way to user-like risks. If you want to invest in Ford, the return on your investment depends on the managerial expertise of Ford Motor Corporation. If you want to buy an F-150, maybe the engine blows up. Those are different transactions. Those are different risks. And I think that Judge Torres' approach in Ripple got it absolutely right. I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend, but I think Judge Torres got it absolutely right in that case.
Well, let me just jump in there because you say I don't think it did. I agree with everything you said. The question is where you draw that line between at what point it is still a capital raising transaction and at what point the transaction is based on the Ford 150 going to the show, not making a 50x return on the ticket.
Yeah, I hear you.
But that's Beanie Babies, right? And lots of things that are part of whatever the SEC's like new ecosystem theory. The problem with not making this distinction between secondary market transactions, where the issuer no longer is promising the holder a share of profits, ownership, whatever, like a traditional security. The problem that it's very difficult to draw a principled dividing line between things that are clearly not securities, but are part of ecosystem.
So here's a principled way forward, which is your exchange. You guys do a terrific job, lots of transparency, surveillance, all of those kinds of things. The SEC and the CFTC could get together and say, if a platform meets these criteria, we're going to suspend these questions of classification in terms of facilitating of trading.
So maybe then, whereas federal regulation would be incredibly powerful and accretive to stable coins, laws would not be as effective as guidance or exemptions or some form of exemption. In the case of secondary market,
what are we really protecting in the secondary market? If you have a good distribution where you have good disclosure, what we're trying to protect in the secondary market is manipulative trading. So if you meet those standards for a platform in the secondary market, that's a way forward.
Let me give you an example of why the lack of guidance is really hurting us as an economy. Because we don't have guidance as to what disclosure should look like. We're allowing the European Union right now to develop the very first threads of what crypto disclosure looks like. And just as the United States guided the world through the 20th century because we came up with the disclosure regime with the 33 and 34 Acts that the world built on, this time around, by being absent at the switch, the Europeans are going to set the standard. And once those standards are set, the United States is going to be a rule taker, not a rule leader.
And the SEC as a regulator doesn't actually have to wait for Congress to act to create some sort of tailored token registration and disclosure regime, right? I like to think that if Jay had stayed on as chair, that the SEC
we put the guidelines the guidelines in place to do it.
Exactly, would have continued moving in that direction. They have really broad exemptive powers, which you were saying, Congress should speak. Congress did speak in the 1990s when it granted the SEC these really broad powers, and they've used it multiple times before, right? Like with asset-backed securities, alternative trading systems, and then I think like just last month with registered annuity-linked bonds. And so they have the power to do this. And in fact, Gary acknowledged this 2 years ago. And I think, the politics around all of this kind of changed. But the SEC could act tomorrow and pass a workable, tailored disclosure and registration regime for token issuers that would protect customers and allow token issuers to actually issue tokens in the U.S., which to this date, they largely have not been able to do. So we don't need legislation.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground in 45 minutes, you guys. I have one last question for you as we run out of time. Title of the talk is How to Regulate Crypto. We have 4 thought leaders on how to regulate crypto, so I want to ask each of them. How should we regulate crypto? Let's do a lightning round. V, let's start with you on the end. Tell me, after what you've heard today and what you've said today, how should we regulate spot markets and how should we regulate stable?
I sort of think the approach I just discussed is the preferable one, especially when it comes to token issuers. That's sort of the foundational question we need to address, right? Obviously, crypto intermediaries like exchanges, like custodians, there are more complicated market structure questions involved. But just for the very basic issue of how should token issuers be regulated, I think the SEC should pursue rulemaking and create a regime that's actually workable for token issuers to come in. Right now, the S1s, right? So the securities registration requirements, just disclosure requirements, they don't make sense for crypto. They ask for a lot of information that isn't relevant or doesn't apply, while not eliciting information that's actually very material to purchasers of crypto. And so if the SEC would use their exemptive powers to pass some sort of tailored regime, I think that would go a long way to creating a workable, functional, and safe crypto market in the U.S.
Thank you. Heath?
Very quickly. So I don't think there's a silver bullet to get us from where we are today to where we need to go. It's going to be a variety of things. So stable coins, I think legislation would be incredibly helpful there because right now we're using money transmitter statutes that are ill fit for purpose. We don't have the regulators are unable to sort of make that a national market for the reasons that I discussed earlier. CFTC for spot jurisdiction, CFTC will actually need the legislation. They can't write rules at this point to govern that. So having, for all the reasons that you stated, it could be very beneficial. SEC, I agree. I think they have the tools they need in the 33 Act, the 34 Act, and other statutes to go forward with it. They just need some courage. The people that you put in really matter. So that should be obvious, but that's critically important. We need the people that care about innovation, that are willing to take risk and be smart and prudent about it. Final point I'll make is regulate crypto. To some extent, that's a misnomer. What we really want to regulate are financial services involving crypto. We need to be very careful not to regulate or have financial regulation imposed on the underlying layer 1s, layer 2s, and other blockchains. So that's an infrastructure question, but many of you, it's vital to you. So I think that needs to be sorted too.
The biggest risk to the American way of life, the biggest risk to all of us, our children and grandchildren, is the amount of national debt that our politicians have piled on us. And there's only one way out of it because we're not going to cut our social programs. It's just politically unpalatable. The only way out is economic growth. We need 2 or 3 decades of sustained 4% economic growth to grow out of our mountain of debt. And the only way we're going to do that in the 21st century is through technology. We must be leading in every new technology, from AI to digital networks of value. In the 21st century, all value is going to move on digital-based networks. And if the United States doesn't lead, others are stepping up to take leadership from us. This has got to be the way forward. And so what I would say to every executive branch head in the United States, they must make capital formation to support technical innovation priority one. We've been so focused on safety, we've completely lost the plot in terms of technological leadership. Every financial regulator in Washington must be advancing technological innovation so that the 21st century is an American century of dominating finance in the same way the 20th century was.
Agree with all that immediately and incrementally. Today, stablecoin guidance for banks and non-banks. This is a good stablecoin if it satisfies these criteria immediately. Bring the regulated financial institutions into the space, get rid of SAB 121. And then for platforms, provide immediate guidance from the CFTC, the SEC, that if capital raising has not taken place for the last 6 months, you can have advice on that from counsel. Capital raising has not taken place in the last 6 months, and everybody who's an affiliate or an issuer is locked down, you can put it on a platform and trade it.
Chairman, counsel, thank you very much.